Protect yourself from UV rays. The first thing you can do obviously is stay indoors, but we don't want you spending your entire life indoors. We want you to be able to get out and be active and have a productive and healthy life. So that means that we need to be smart about our UV exposure and making sure we're using the right kinds of protection. So if you're going to be outside spending the day, ideally we'd like you to be under some form of shade or shade coverage versus being in direct light. And ideally, specifically try not to be in direct sunlight between the hours of 10 a.m. and 4 p.m. when the sun's rays are usually the strongest and the most direct. A simple test to be able to tell if you're in the peak hours of sunlight exposure during the day is by using the shadow test. If you're standing in direct sunlight and your shadow is not as tall or taller than you are, then you know that you're in those peak hours of the day where you're getting more aggressive direct light exposure. We often think about sun exposure and increased risk of sunburn as a specific day. We're going to go spend a day at the beach or a day at the lake or something along those lines. And so we think about coverage at that moment of time. But UV exposure is an accumulation over time. So you have to think about it on a day-to-day basis. If you're out working in the yard, working in your garden, any kind of time that you're spending out exercising are all times when you should really ideally still be thinking about sunscreen and UV protection. A lot of times we also think if it's hazy or cloudy outside that we don't have to worry about UV exposure, but the UV rays in the sunlight do still penetrate through the clouds and the haze, and we can still get a sunburn or direct exposure from that if we are not doing things to protect ourselves. So you have to take that into consideration. Just because it might be cooler at a particular time of year, such as spring or fall, also does not mean that you're not getting UV exposure. Or just because you're in a place where you might feel cooler, such as being in the water, does not mean that you're not getting UV exposure. You can still get sun rays through the water and still get a sunburn even in the water. And you might be staying indoors to try to avoid direct sunlight, but if you're sitting inside indoors of a window where there might be a very well lit window in that direct sunlight, if the glass is not rated for UV absorption, you might still be getting direct UV lights even through the glass. So this can apply whether you're in your house or in your car driving, you may still be getting UV damage. It is not uncommon for me to see people in my office who have an asymmetrical aging on their left side of their face if they're someone who has to spend a lot of time driving in their car. And also you need to think about it if you're propping your arm up on the side window of the car. Both of those areas are going to be getting increased sun exposure and can still have UV damage. Now, most glass in cars in particular do have chemicals in there or a layer of protection that does help with UV absorption, but it's not going to be 100%. It also may depend on the degree of tinting that is in your car. The greater the degree of tint, the more of the sun rays that are absorbed and aren't going to come through the car window and will decrease your likelihood of having UV exposure. However, you need to check your local laws as to the level of tinting that is permitted in your area so that you don't receive an infraction. If you're planning on spending a lot of time outdoors, you might want to check the UV index in your area. This is something that can be done on the EPA's, Environmental Protection Agency's website, or a lot of times you can find on your local weather station. The UV index is going to be dependent on a number of factors. It's going to be dependent on where you are on the Earth's crust, so your location and geography, the time of year, depending on how your location is directly tilted towards the sun from the Earth's axis or not, and also the altitude. The higher that you are up in the atmosphere, the less protection that you're going to have. So everybody's UV index is going to be different depending on where they are in location and time of year. A simple way to remember what we need to do for UV protection is seen on the CDC and American Cancer Society's websites, and that includes slip, slop, slap, and wrap. So slip on a shirt or covering of clothing, slop on some sunscreen, slap on a hat, and wrap around those eyes so that we have that protection. So let's first talk about clothing. Ideally, we want to be wearing clothing that has a great deal of protection from the sun. So that's going to be things such as wearing long sleeves, wearing long pants, long skirts versus short sleeves or shorts, or minimal clothes such as a bikini or swimsuit. The other thing is you want to think about the type of clothing that you're wearing. Dark clothes are going to absorb more of the UV rays of sunlight than a light colored clothing. The weave of the product of the clothing is going to make a difference. The tighter the weave, the more absorption. And you also want to look for particular pieces of clothing or fabrics that have UV protection built in them. So this happens to be a specific sports or shirt, ideally designed for fly fishing. This is my one of my outdoor shirts. I love this because it's lightweight, it's very breathable, but it has a very tight weave in the fabric. And this shirt actually came labeled with a UV protection, meaning that it's been tested and treated to offer UV protection from exposure. So it also, again, has long sleeves, so I'm getting great protection. But not all clothing is ever going to protect you 100%. So if you've been outside long enough for a long enough period of time, even with a long sleeve shirt on, you might have found that areas that have less material in them or layers of the material, you might have a low grade tan or sunburn through, whereas areas that have double layers, such as the placa or the sleeves of the clothing, you may not have as much as a sunburn and might actually kind of have a little bit of difference, almost looks like a tattoo of the shirt that you're wearing. So you do have to be aware that just because you do have long sleeves on or wear clothing that has UV protection factor in it, doesn't mean it's going to still protect you from the sunlight 100%. When you think about your clothing, a general rule of thumb is if you can see through the clothing, then so can the sun's rays. The other thing is a lot of times we'll wear clothing to help reduce our sun exposure. Because I am fair-skinned, usually when I go out in an area of sunlight for a long period of time, such as to the beach, I will usually wear a swim shirt to help reduce direct sunlight on my skin, prevent burns. But when your material and your fabric gets wet, you again have a higher risk of the sun penetrating through versus when the fabric is dry. There are now products that you can get that you can treat your clothing with to help increase the UV protection. And certain things like laundry detergent sometimes now will have chemicals that when you wash your clothes, they will also help increase the UV protection on your clothes. So that's something that you might want to be checking into as well.